Hi, we are Jen Rue and Alicia Pooley, and our presentation is on adolescence and how substance abuse impacts an adolescent's brain, their life, and the role of the school counselor and how to create a comprehensive school counseling program. So we're going to start with the basics. What is addiction? Well, from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, addiction is a compulsive need for and use of habit-forming substances such as heroin, nicotine, or alcohol, characterized by tolerance and well-defined physiological symptoms. Addiction does not discriminate, and it can happen to anyone, regardless of your age, socioeconomic status, religion, gender, race, or ethnicity. No matter who you are vulnerable to the destructive effects that alcohol and drugs can have. Now, there are different levels of becoming addicted to drugs and alcohol. A person could simply abuse drugs or alcohol, and by doing that, it could lead to drug dependence. And drug dependence means that a person needs the drugs to function normally. And if that person were to abruptly stop using, they would actually experience withdrawal, which then leads into drug addiction. And that's the compulsive use of drugs or alcohol, even though it has a negative effect on your body, as well as the consequences of using. There's actually a progression that occurs during adolescence when one goes from never using drugs or alcohol to becoming addicted. And if you look at this picture, you can see how easy it is to go from experimental use to actual dependence and all the little steps that take place in between. In an article titled "A Brief High School Prevention Program to Decrease Alcohol Usage and Change Social Norms," according to the SAMHSA, adolescent substance abuse is a serious public health problem, with almost 10% of youths ages 12 to 17 reporting the use of illicit drugs, and 7% of those kids meet the criteria for actually suffering from a substance abuse disorder. If you look at these charts we have on statistics, these were taken on kids in 8th, 10th, and 12th grade, and the one I find to be the most impactful is the age at which teens report drinking their first alcoholic beverages. So you can see 12 years and younger, 25% of kids report having had their first drink, and that number decreases as a person gets older. This came from age teens report drinking. So it just goes to show you how important it is to provide prevention programs at an earlier age and not wait until someone is older to provide the information needed to maybe deter them from ever taking their first drink. The other slides here also show percentages of 8th, 10th, and 12th grade students and their drinking patterns. So how many kids drank in the past month, how many have been drunk, binge drinking, or actually drinking daily. And the last slide here is a percentage of how many kids actually either drink alcohol, smoke cigarettes, or smoke marijuana. And you could see alcohol use is pretty prevalent among all of those grades. Then marijuana use, which is interesting, and smoking is the least likely that kids are engaging in. Variety of drugs and alcohols that could lead to addiction, and parents, school counselors, as well as adolescents need to become familiar with the different types of drugs and what they look like, their street names, and most importantly, the effects that these drugs can have on the body. The first drug we're going to look at is alcohol, and whether people believe it or not, alcohol is a drug, and most people will drink small amounts of alcohol to get the stimulant effect of it, but then when a person drinks more than their body can actually tolerate, it becomes a depressant, and that's when you see people slurring their words or falling, because they can't stand up straight. Your body can only process a certain amount of alcohol, and when it exceeds that limit, you might notice that your breathing slows down, which decreases the amount of oxygen that's getting to your brain, which in essence could cause coma or even death. And you know, dependency starts when a person feels the need to drink, and that turns into a loss of control, and you become dependent on it. When you go through withdrawal of alcohol, you could actually die from it. And this is all because a person's tolerance increases. The next drug we're going to be looking at is vaping, and it's also known as juuling. This involves the process of inhaling and exhaling a vapor produced by an e-cigarette or a similar device. And the most popular brand on the market right now is the Juul, and it looks like a flash drive, as you can see from the picture. And the teen basically buys the pod, which contains the nicotine, and they attach it to the device. And they're so small, you can easily hide them. You could charge it to your laptop or a USB charger. The dangers of vaping, they say at this point, is obviously you can become addictive. It could lead to lung disease, type 2 diabetes, and chronic bronchitis. Um, but the chemicals that are used in these Juuls haven't yet been studied. So sadly, we don't even know what the long-term effects are at this point, but they do say that juuling is as bad as smoking, if not worse, because it's like actually smoking a carton, a cartridge of a Juul is the equivalent of smoking a pack of cigarettes. So it definitely has a negative impact on your body. Another type of drugs teen use are over-the-counter drugs like cough suppressants. These can cause out-of-body experiences, organ failure. Kids might say, you know, do you have any Dex or Tussin, Robo? These are all street names that um, for the term over-the-counter drugs, such as like cough syrup. Um, Kids suffer from hallucinations when they're taken in high dosages, and even psychosis. The next slide is prescription painkillers, which are also known as opiates, and they're extremely dangerous for many reasons. Because adolescents think that because the doctor prescribed it, even if it's prescribed for another person, that it's safe to take. And these prescription painkillers work by changing how your brain perceives pain, and it promotes a false sense of well-being and like a calmness. Unfortunately, even one dose of this prescription drug can slow a person's heart rate or breathing, which could have a permanent effect on the brain and cause brain damage. And teens don't realize that by selling prescription drugs, it's the same as dealing illegal drugs. And if a person dies from what you sold them, you can end up going to jail for murder. There's also prescription stimulants, and they stimulate the central nervous system and they increase a person's energy level. These drugs are Ritalin, Adderall, sometimes they're called kiddie cocaine. The short-term effects on taking this drug is sleepiness or high blood pressure. Um, Again, these are highly addictive as well. And your high on this is so short-lived that you want to take the drug again just to feel normal. Um, you're not even taking it at this point to get high. So that's very scary. Sedatives slow your brain. These are drugs like Klonopin and Valium, Ativan, or Xanax. And again, these are prescription drugs that teens may sell to each other or take from their parents' cabinets. It's easy to overdose when you mix these drugs with alcohol. People have fallen asleep and they never wake up again. Heroin is, I think, talked about a lot these days. It's highly addictive. It comes from the poppy plant. The withdrawal symptoms from heroin are excruciating, and that's sadly what keeps people taking the drug because the withdrawal is horrible. People take heroin, either they ingest it through their veins, they smoke it, they sniff it. And the reason people are dying so rapidly from this drug is because they're using the drug and they don't know the strength of it or their own tolerance and how much they can take. And they end up chasing that same high that they may have had in the past, and then they end up overdosing. If you look at the chart real quick, it shows that the rate of people from 1999 to 2017, how many people have died over the years, how that's increasing, especially when it's mixed with other synthetic narcotics. Methamphetamines are an illegal drug. They're a stimulant. They affect you physically and mentally. If you look at the picture here, I mean, it's heartbreaking to see a woman at 31 and a few years later she looks like she's 91. These are the effects of this drug, and sometimes people can suffer permanent psychosis, brain damage, heart problems, paranoia. You've heard of tweakers, and that's the name given to people who use meth. Um, the consequences are detrimental. I mean, you see her skin, she's constantly picking at her skin. That's part of using this drug. You can suffer from poor hygiene, and then your teeth fall out of your head. So it's a very sad process. Um, and then the last drug is ecstasy, and this is another stimulant that causes hallucinations. Um, you could see from like people, you've heard of raves. So kids go, they party, they get all hot and sweaty, and they take this drug, ecstasy, which looks like a lot of fun to take, and it's hearts and little alien heads and smiley faces. But this drug increases your body temperature. So imagine you're dancing and sweaty, and then you take this. You know, if your body temperature reaches 105 degrees, it causes a medical emergency, and in some circumstances, it could cause death. Um, So individuals who take ecstasy don't know what was put in that pill or how their body will react to it, and that's why it's so dangerous. And when you take it, you can become a victim of rape or any other type of violence.
So next we're going to talk about the developmental considerations of the adolescent brain and what it can take as an adolescent engages in substance abuse. So the adolescent brain is basically still under construction during maturation, where anything can affect how the organ matures itself. During infancy and childhood, the brain is forming and multiplying in its knowledge. As a person enters adolescence, it is a crucial time for the brain, despite many of those connections already being well established. As the brain is developing, risk-taking becomes a major marker for teenagers. This makes it very difficult to recognize signs that an adolescent is engaging in substance abuse, because moodiness and the autonomy that they're striving for can often be masked just by an adolescent being a teenager. There are theories out there that even say evolution and the survival instinct in our genes can be blamed for the risk-taking marker. As the brain develops, it is constantly pushing us to our boundaries, whether it's learning to walk, talk, do math, or pretty much anything. There needs to be continued progression in order for us to continue excelling. This way of thinking for adolescents and their risk-taking could be evolutionary based, traced back to our ancestors. As they matured, they were encouraged to push the envelope, so to speak, in order to survive, in order to find new land, food, waters, tools, and completely change their way of thinking in order to make the civilizations that we learn about. This was something that with this in mind, we go back to adolescence and their risky behavior when it comes to the use of drugs and alcohol. Due to adolescents' urge to engage in risky behaviors, they become at an increased risk of developing a substance abuse disorder. So all in all, adolescents are at an increased risk of developing this disorder because they are biologically wired to take risk and even rebel against authority for their need to be autonomous. There's growing literature and research that speaks to the different responses the adolescent body has to drugs or alcohol compared to adults. In one study done by Winters and Aria, they shed some light on just how differently the adolescent body responds to alcohol and drugs compared to adults. The research went on to experiment with adolescent rats, and when exposed to alcohol consumption, the adolescent rat actually experienced less disruption in the motor function compared to their adult counterparts. This showed that the adolescent rat had a lowered sensitivity to alcohol. This lower sensitivity could be to blame for the high quantity that adolescents tend to engage in during teenage years. If they are not feeling the full effects of the drug, then they were going to continue to misuse the substance. In the study, they attempted to see how the brain itself reacts to alcohol in an adult and adolescent rat. Winters and Aria demonstrated that adolescent rats ingested with alcohol revealed significantly more brain damage in their prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex is most known for being important in decision making. And it also showed brain damage in their working memory brain region compared to the adult rats. So continuing to use alcohol is just going to lead to even more poor decision making because they're ruining that part of their brain. When exposing the rats to alcohol on a long-term basis, the results showed dramatic brain damage in multiple regions. These regions were responsible and associated with learning and language acquisition. The study that Winters and Arias spoke at great lengths about the effects of alcohol on the brain. The researchers eventually went on to say that adolescents who have recently recovered from an alcohol dependency disorder revealed poor performance on verbal and nonverbal compared to a control group. Aside from alcohol, adolescents who engage in the use of marijuana were shown to have a less efficient pattern of activation compared to those who don't. This includes the use of working memory, verbal learning, cognitive control, and a lot of other things. Not only that, but they were shown to have a reduced volume in the hippocampal region. For the next study that we looked at was a part of Bava and Tappert in 2010. It spoke to how the brain is so fragile and just how much the maturing brain is going to be affected by alcohol and drug abuse. These researchers speculated that there was an asynchronized development between the reward and control systems that heightened adolescents' responsiveness to engaging in risky behaviors. Higher blood alcohol concentrations are associated with poor tissue integrity in the corpus callosum, and that is the part of the brain where nerve fibers actually join the two hemispheres of the brain. Having that disconnectivity can be detrimental to learning new things and just being able to communicate between the right and left hemisphere. This study and the ones it drew on indicated that heavy drinking during adolescence may be associated with declines in cognitive performance and brain health. Adolescent alcohol and marijuana use indicated weaknesses in a lot of different brain parts. Kids who use drugs early in adolescence are more at risk for developing a substance abuse disorder, and among youth who begin drinking, this statistic we came across was interesting, but among the youth who begin drinking at 11 or 12 years of age, 7.2% were found to have an alcohol use disorder within 2 years, whereas compared to adolescents who did not start drinking until 21, their prevalence of an alcohol use disorder within 2 years was 3.7. So now we're going to get into the multicultural perspective. In order to fully understand what alcohol problems exist in the school, we need to be able to differentiate between what populations are most at risk and how alcohol affects certain groups of people. So one perspective we researched was the difference between gender. In this study with Khan et al., 2014, it characterized the different alcohol use typologies between males and females. For example, males have the highest severity class, meaning that they experience disproportionate risk of alcohol-related consequences compared to those abstained from alcohol and other alcohol-using groups. There was a large percentage of females that actually regretted their decision to drink according to this study. Occasional heavy drinkers were actually seen to be at a higher risk of alcohol-related problems compared to frequent heavy drinkers among adolescent females. Another difference that they observed was that while males as a population experience substantial heterogeneity in the type of alcohol-related problems, this ranged from family to friends to dating, yet among females, problems with dating and or sex emerged as the key consequence to alcohol use. These findings point all to a need for a more gender-specific alcohol reduction program in order to target the responses that we need from the adolescents. The study also went on to compare the different effects that alcohol has on certain populations and the consequences of that. More specifically, it compared alcohol usage of white Americans, African Americans, and Hispanic Americans. The research found that white and Hispanic people are significantly more likely to use alcohol in the previous year compared to African Americans, as you can see through the statistics. In this slide, you can kind of just see exactly, this was part of the research and the study that we were looking at, but if you look down the white column, it has the highest percentages of all of the counterparts. It doesn't matter male, female, but white people are actually at more risk of developing a substance abuse disorder. White males were more likely than the other two groups to be drinkers, which included the subgroup of being a heavy drinker, and white frequent heavy drinkers had very high levels of consumption compared to Hispanics and African Americans. African American frequent drinkers were found to have the lowest risk of social problems compared to white and Hispanic heavy drinkers. Among white females in the study, each adolescent alcohol class was associated with increased odds of adulthood marijuana use, with frequent heavy users at the greatest odds of adulthood marijuana use. Also, among white females, it was found that the group of occasional users or heavy users with alcohol-related problems in adolescence were strongly correlated with having greater odds of adulthood cocaine use, which is very scary. Being a drinker in any of the alcohol class was strongly correlated with adolescent marijuana use and marijuana use risk increasing dramatically with increasing severity in alcohol use class. All in all, the results of this study showed the apparently well-established trend of higher levels of adolescent alcohol use among white versus African American adolescents, and suggested that Hispanics have levels of alcohol consumption comparable to those of adolescents. This study also showed that there should be a different programs to counteract the adolescent alcohol use problems happening in schools and have it be more specialized to gender. Drinking and substance use has become too normalized to adolescents in the school, and the only way to get ahead of it is to change the way in which we teach students about alcohol and other substances that can be harmful. Throughout this presentation, we have so far outlined the statistics, the facts on almost all the drugs out there, the effects that adolescent drug use and alcohol use can have on the brain, and finally the different groups or people, gender and race, that are most at risk for substance abuse in adulthood, and also present social problems that these adolescents can run into if deciding to give in to their risk-taking urge and partaking in the use of drugs or alcohol. The adverse effects are great and can have lasting effects into adulthood. Next, we are going to talk about the programs that are currently out there to counteract the drug and alcohol problems for adolescents.
So the role of the school counselor is extremely important, and when you look at the ASCA model, it explains that the role of the school counselor is to help students overcome barriers to learning. It also requires that effective professional school counselors are required to provide students with information regarding substance abuse and awareness. So the school counselor's job is first to educate themselves so that they can better educate students and parents and the community on the dangers of and signs and symptoms of alcohol and drug use. Adolescents are starting to use drugs and alcohol younger and younger, so as it was pointed out in the previous slide, it's so important to get these prevention programs in the schools sooner rather than later in order to combat this epidemic. While we were researching, we came across an article which was entitled An Update on Adolescent Drug Use, What Counselors Need to Know. And the article speaks about a prevention program called Project Alert. The program was created to help educate and prevent drug and alcohol use. The curriculum was designed to meet the students where they were developmentally, and it also focused on the permanent effects of using drugs and alcohol, which they found was really important when working with young people because they live in the moment. So if you focus on the permanent effect of like your friend dying, that might have a more profound effect on them and their choices that they make. This Project Alert was seeking to change students' beliefs about the physical, social, and emotional consequences of using drugs. The program also hoped to prepare students with the tools that they need so they don't succumb to peer pressure, and it also wanted to teach them that they have the ability to resist the temptations. We were reminded in the article that as school counselors, it's recommended by the American School Counselor Association that we collaborate with teachers in order to provide guidance curriculum lessons. You know, counselors play a significant role in a child's life. When trust is established, counselors can truly encourage students not to experiment with drugs or alcohol, teach them about addiction and the ramifications of mixing drugs and alcohol. And in order for this program to be successful, counselors need to be credible and provide information directly to each grade level and meet the kids where they're at. We also learned of another classroom-based substance program, prevention program that's called Refuse, Remove, Reasons, and it's RRR. And that was implemented in urban as well as suburban high schools. It attempted to create activities that students work on while creating social norms among them. And this helped the students feel capable of helping each other. And the curriculum allowed for students to role play, and it encouraged parental involvement, which is wonderful because we want our parents involved in helping these kids out and also being educated on the types of drugs that are out there. Some literature also suggests that you do brief interventions over the computer or a web-based program might be effective. It's believed that adolescents overestimate the amount of alcohol that their friends consume, which then could lead to drinking more in order to keep up with their peers. The goal of this prevention program is to provide adolescents with accurate information in a non-judgmental way. It's a personal approach to emphasizing risks and norms compared to their peers. And these programs range from 30-minute lessons to multiple sessions to educate adolescents on decision making. The programs are designed to change the student's perspective. The advantages of providing this type of program in the school is that it can impact all the students, and the information can be presented on a personal as well as academic level. Also, kids enjoy being on the computer and online, and apparently the pictures that are used on this program grab students' attention and keeps them engaged. Another advantage, they say, of using this web-based program is it doesn't require staff to be trained, which then, of course, lessens the school's cost to send guidance counselors out there to learn this information. And a web-based program may be preferable because it includes assessments and provides feedback. The last one is called random school drug testing, and this is very controversial. It's said to be effective, but you really need to have all stakeholders involved. And the goal is to deter drug use and alcohol use. It should be confidential, involve everybody. And if a child is randomly tested and they test positive, they don't want to punish the child. They want the kid to continue to attend school. But of course, there's people who feel like this is negative and it shouldn't take place because it invades their privacy. But it is being used around schools all around the United States. So there are many things that the counselor should be knowledgeable on when it comes to substance abuse among adolescents. You know, the counselor should be able to identify risks that make some adolescents more at risk for engaging substance use. Not only that, but being able to recognize the signs that might indicate an adolescent is using or doing drugs. Counselors are in a really unique position because sometimes they have the same students year after year, whereas teachers are only in contact with some of these kids just for that school year. A comprehensive school counseling program can only be achieved through education, which means educating teachers, counselors, parents, students themselves on the effects of using drugs and alcohol and what those effects could have on the brain and the long-term consequences of it. Lambie in 2002 laid out 4 tasks that a counselor must do in order to counteract the drug problem, and these tasks were identifying the warning signs of substance abuse, working with the young people to establish a therapeutic relationship, support the family system to promote change, and lastly, be a resource and a liaison between the student, the family, the school, and the community agencies, as well as treatment programs.
So, all in all, this presentation should show that an effective, comprehensive school counseling program must have counselors that are not only knowledgeable on substances and alcohol, but also on how engaging in the use of these substances can affect adolescents and their development. Through this presentation, we have outlined all of the adverse effects premature drug and alcohol use can have on adolescents. We have shown what populations are most at risk for developing alcohol dependency disorders and substance abuse disorders. Although alcohol may affect males and females differently, the consequences of engaging in the risky behavior that is substance misuse can permanently change an adolescent's life and future. We, as future school counselors, need to be aware of the warning signs and knowledgeable on how to efficiently help a student struggling with substance abuse. These are all the references used, and thanks for listening to our
Yes, thank
presentation.
you.
Thanks.